Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. So you guys probably remember there was this war. It was going to be the war to end all wars. It was this existential conflict. Vladimir Putin was going to march his way across Europe, destroy democracy, end the liberal world order. All of this was just terrible. We had to send hundreds of billions of dollars over there to save Ukraine from this. And it was the most important conflict of our lifetime or any lifetime. And then we just stopped hearing about it. It completely disappeared from the news. No one seems to care anymore. I've heard every once in a while, if you're watching the Olympics and a Ukrainian's involved, they'll reference it. But otherwise, we basically have heard nothing about this conflict for a very long time. And if you're like me, you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, whatever happened to this world war, this war that was going to be the most important thing we could imagine, the battle of our lifetime? How did it just vanish and disappear? I mean, I assume the war is still going on. Maybe we should learn something about it. So joining me today to fill us in on whatever happened to the Ukraine war is the great YouTuber Charlemagne. Thanks for joining me, man.
Hello. Great to be back again. Thank you.
Of course, always a fantastic time talking to Charlemagne. We're going to dive into the background. Why was there this huge shift away from attention on the Ukraine war? What is the status of the Ukraine war? Is it winnable by either side? What would be the fallout? And why has it been so important for the global order to shift their focus away from what was supposed to be the defining conflict of our time? But before we get into all that, guys, let's hear from today's sponsor. Universities today aren't just neglecting real education, they're actively undermining it, and we can't let them get away with it. America was made for an educated and engaged citizenry. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute is here to help. ISI offers programs and opportunities for conservative students across the country. ISI understands that conservatives and right-of-center students feel isolated on college campuses and that you're often fighting for your own reputation, dignity, and future. Through ISI, you can learn about what Russell Kirk called the permanent things, the philosophical and political teachings that shaped and made Western civilization great. ISI offers many opportunities to jumpstart your career. They have fellowships at some of the nation's top conservative publications like National Review, The American Conservative, and The College Thinker. If you're a graduate student, ISI offers funding opportunities to sponsor the next great generation of college professors. Through ISI, you can work with conservative thinkers who are making a difference. Thinkers like Chris Rufo, who currently has an ISI researcher helping him with his book. But perhaps most importantly, ISI offers college students a community of people that can help them grow. If you're a college student, ISI can help you start a student organization or a student newspaper or meet other like-minded students at their various conferences and events. ISI is here to educate the next generation of great Americans. To learn more, go to isi.org. That's isi.org. So Charlemagne, we're in this scenario right after COVID where you thought that the elites would calm down. They wouldn't want to stress the system. The global world order had flexed a lot of muscle trying to suppress its citizens. In many cases, it had destroyed its own economies through the constant lockdowns. And I, for one, was still kind of on the academic agent wagon of, okay, well, the global elites are still in control of what they're doing. So they're certainly not going to put us through a massive stress test of the system right away again. But then we had the Ukraine war, and it became important for every Western nation to go ahead and dedicate their entire military output to the defense of this nation. We were told that the Russian army was going to march its way all the way through Western Europe. It was going to conquer the entire continent. It was critical that the entire West dedicate itself to this defense. The media was going on and on about this 24/7, and we were assured that Russia's defeat would be very quick. Joe Biden told us that they would just manipulate the currency, they'd bankrupt the country, they'd isolate them from global trade, and this would be over in a matter of months, a story we've heard many times when it comes to any given war. But slowly over time, it became clear that maybe this would be a more protracted conflict, and we had to go ahead and fork over hundreds of billions of dollars. We had to fund Ukraine's retirement pension system for their government. just a massive amount of funding went into this, but we were assured again that Ukraine was their victory was inevitable. The Russian spirit was broken, they were taking ridiculous losses, and it was only a matter of time. And then slowly but surely, this war just started to drop off the radar. We heard less and less about it. The news had always been shaky and unreliable. It was a vast amount of propaganda from both sides, but especially, obviously, here in the West, we got a lot of propaganda about how Ukraine was going to turn the corner at any moment, but they just never seemed to get a foothold. And now the war has just entirely disappeared from the media. I don't think anyone talks about it pretty much at all at this point, except when it's time to once again beg for money. So for most people, there's just simply no news about what's going on. For the people who aren't aware, what is going on? What is the status of the war? Are the Ukrainians just about to turn the corner? Are the Russians on the edge of victory? What is the general overview of what is happening on the ground?
Okay, well, that's definitely a big question to answer. In general, the war is in its, I would say, middle phase, where Russia is slowly demonstrating its advantages, especially in military materiel, and is beginning to push most parts of the front toward taking control of the entire four oblasts that they've annexed, especially Donetsk and Luhansk. So we're seeing now a turnabout where instead of the Ukrainians either holding or in some cases making small advances like they did in last year's spring or summer offensive, it's now the Russians who have the momentum. And that momentum is accelerating, particularly after the fall of the fortress city Avdiivka in March of this year. And so it's quite clear at this point that the Ukrainian capability to launch offensives against the Russians is basically exhausted. And as our own General Patton said, no one ever defended anything successfully. You attack, you attack, you attack. And if the Ukrainians can't attack anymore, except in very limited capacities, they're not actually going to be able to defeat the Russians and push them out of their country. Whereas on the Russian side, the Russians are gaining an increasing amount of territory and inflicting an increasing amount of casualties on the Ukrainians. So if you just look at the numbers and you project current trends into the future, the Ukrainian army is probably going to be at the breaking point, let's say, we're on day 870 or something like that right now. Let's say in another 870 days, the Ukrainian army is probably going to be at its breaking point, if not before then, or there could be a peace arrangement. But that's where things are trending. It's trending toward at least the minimum Russian victory, where they successfully take the Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk oblasts that they've formally annexed into the Russian Federation.
So what is the key factor that is allowing the Russians to make this consistent headway? I know we've seen a lot about the Ukrainian forces. Obviously, the plan of most Western nations was to kill Russians until every Ukrainian man was gone. From what I've heard, they're drafting up to very above middle aged men. Very hard to find men anymore to staff the army. You also sent me a lot of information about just the munitions deficit, just the fact that they were not able to continue to shell on a regular basis the way they had been able to previously, which was making it difficult for them to be competitive. Is it just they're just missing out on both men and munitions at this point?
It's mostly the much vaunted 155 millimeter shell, which is sort of the backbone of Ukraine's artillery. In any given war, artillery amounts to about 80% of the total casualties. So it's really what makes or breaks an army in warfare. Now, a few years ago, in 2023, actually, even the Ukrainians, especially while they were on their counteroffensive, were firing more artillery shells per day on the key combat areas than the Russians. But now the Russians have pulled way ahead in that sphere. So current metrics, at least from March, place it at about 2,000 shells per day from Ukraine and 10,000 shells per day from Russia being fired. And that may sound like a lot, but it's not compared to older wars like World War I, where millions of rounds were expended in a month. Now, basically, what this amounts to is that Russia is going to be able to kill far more Ukrainians than Ukrainians are able to kill Russians. And this is not just a linear problem, but it's more like logarithmic or geometric, because when you're firing more and more shells, that snowballs into other advantages in terms of how you can use your own infantry, right? So as Russia continues to pull ahead in artillery production and use, the Ukrainians are going to suffer more and more casualties. As that article I sent you references, the quote in it was, let me see if I could pull it up. Yes, a source from Ukraine's general staff provided Reuters with the information that when Ukraine was firing 10,000 shells per day, between 35 and 45 Ukrainian soldiers were killed daily, and about 250 to 300 wounded. But when the daily fire fell to half that, more than 100 Ukrainian soldiers were killed per day, and at least 1,000 were wounded. So we can see that, according to this source, when the amount of shells being fired by Ukraine halved, the number of killed and wounded by Ukraine or on Ukraine's side went up far more than double, right? So this is a big problem for Ukraine, and it's not really one they can solve because their primary source of shells is from the West, from the United States of America in particular. And we basically expected, our elites expected, that they would be able to ramp up production of 155 millimeter shells and other munitions in order to defeat the Russians. The Russian economy was going to collapse. We were just going to spin up all of these factories and outproduce them. But actually, that's not what's happened. The United States has not even doubled its 155 millimeter production since 2022. In 2022, when the war started, we were at 20,000 shells being produced per month, and now we're only at about 36,000 or so. And remember, I just mentioned that Russia, in its key combat areas, is firing 10,000 shells per day, and the United States is only producing 36,000 per month. And you can do the math there. And this is why Ukraine's shell expenditure of 155 millimeter has decreased all the way down to 2,000 per day. And this is just really the key metric: is the Russians can use their artillery far more than the Ukrainians can, which just gives them every single advantage in modern warfare. It's kind of a boring way to look at it, because people like to talk about drones and ISR and hypersonic missiles, but what it comes down to is artillery, the same as it's always been, especially over the last 100 years since the major advancements in artillery in World War One.
So this is always the problem, I guess, of being used as a pawn in a proxy war, is that you don't actually own your supply lines. You're not responsible for, or you don't have control over the actual munitions that are coming into your country. And is this really a demonstration yet again of the failure of Western logistics? It feels like there was serious errors made, obviously, with the pandemic. The fact that we didn't have all kinds of medical supplies. We recognized that we didn't have the ability to produce antibiotics or all these other things that were necessary in the middle of a medical emergency. And then obviously trade was heavily disrupted, everything else that came from that. And now we recognize that not only do we not make enough of a lot of this stuff, but we don't even have the ability to really create the capacity in any kind of realistic timeline. So America signs itself up basically for this proxy war, and now it doesn't have the ability to actually produce the type of munitions necessary to fight it. This isn't really a heartwarming thought when you have a Western alliance that is pretty clearly trying to gun for some kind of conflict with Iran at this point.
Yeah, it seems to be, although I'm skeptical that any such conflict with Iran will happen.
Yeah.
But in either case, yeah, you're right. I mean, what this is demonstrating is the Americans don't have the capability to spin up their military-industrial complex to compensate for expenditure in an actual war. I mean, we have a huge stockpile. The exact amount is unknown, but we have our own stockpile of 155 millimeter. So we haven't just dumped all of our munitions into Ukraine and have none left for ourselves. But that said, if we were in a direct peer conflict, the same effect would apply. Current production projections, and maybe these are also projections in another way, is 60,000 rounds a month by 2025 and 100,000 a month by 2026, which is still not enough to match what Russia is currently expending. Now, of course, they're digging into deeper stockpiles. It's not like they're manufacturing 10,000 rounds a day or something insane like that. But those stockpiles are going to diminish on our side as well if we were engaged in a full scale war. So, it's that's what, 4 years. So from 2022 to 2026, we can only 5x our 155 millimeter production. I mean, this is not a rate of spinning up your industry and your military industrial complex that's acceptable. For all the money we're actually spending on military, it looks like in the key war-winning areas we're not up to speed, which is of course our own industrial capacity. We have all of these high-tech planes that cost billions of dollars each, literally. Some of them are going to Ukraine now. The F-16s are finally going there, and these are important. It's important to have the highest technology you have available, but this stuff gets expended early on, especially. We saw this in Ukraine, where Ukraine basically can only use its air force defensively against Russian missile attacks at this point, because when you deploy these assets, they are countered by man pads and other things like that, and they get shot down. And then you're back to this meat grinder style of warfare, where it's infantry supported by artillery and tanks on the ground, and it's not some magical world of hypersonic missiles and jets flying around and Star Wars level stuff. It's war as it always has been, and it seems like our industry is not up to speed in terms of being able to fight that war.
So is this this feels like a consistent failure again of many Western militaries, particularly the United States military, that whether the troops themselves have the capability, it seems that the tactics are dictated almost by a defense industry led model of expenditure on, like you said, these extremely, these fancy weapon systems, planes, these kind of things that are exorbitantly priced, but we consistently fall down on kind of these nuts and bolts stuff, the meat and potatoes. We don't have just the basic supplies, the basic capabilities on the ground or in artillery. Everything is concentrated into the newest tech. It's making sure that we have the fanciest weapon system available out there or the right aircraft, when often it's just the necessity of being able to lob artillery or kick in a door that we lack.
Yeah, and you see this touted about on Twitter and stuff too, videos about how ineffective our military is now. And one might think that that is exaggerated, the extent to which you just have too many women in the military. You have entire I saw a video of an entire platoon of women being trained, or quote unquote trained, the other day. And that's good for a laugh, but it's also serious, right? I mean, if you talk, I know a good number of people who have served in the military, and so do you. I know. And what these guys will tell you is basically our special forces are effectively now our regular forces, and the
Right.
regular forces are there just kind of collecting a paycheck. And when it comes down to it, we might have 30,000 at most effective combat troops. Okay, so Ukraine and Russia each have more than 10 times that currently deployed in this war. So we don't have the personnel to fight a war like Ukraine is doing right now, even if we wanted to get involved in that conflict. People talk about, oh, are the Americans going to send troops over there? That's never going to happen, because we don't have the troops available. And it takes like 6 months to deploy an armored division overseas. That's just never going to happen. So on the other hand, and this is an aspect of the war that's really not talked about enough. The Russian armed forces now have 2 years of experience fighting in a modern fifth generation war, and they have over 500,000 troops deployed in Ukraine now. Okay, so Russia as a nation is now developing that institutional memory of how to fight a modern war. And to be fair, the Russians have been fighting, border conflicts for a long time now in other places as well. But this is a much bigger war, right? And now they're developing that institutional memory and that on the ground experience among the soldiers and the NCO officer corps. How does one actually fight a war like this, where you have drones overhead that can potentially see everything? Everyone knows what everyone's doing at all times on each side, and that sort of thing. They know how to fight this now, and Americans don't, because we have zero institutional memory of modern war. I mean, if you really think about it, when was the last time the United States was involved in a war like this? It wasn't even the Iraq War, because in Iraq, you would have soldiers deployed on a base. The base was effectively safe, and then they would go out, fight the Taliban, fight the Iraqis, whomever, and then they would return back to base. In Ukraine, it's not like that. In Ukraine, they are under threat of being shelled or killed constantly. If you're a Russian soldier in there, right? You're just in some dugout in a bunker, and you could be killed at any moment. In the last major war, quote unquote, the Americans fought, or really the last 20 years in the desert, it hasn't been like that. We weren't against peer competitors. The last time we really fought, even in Desert Storm, right, that war was just a snap of the fingers, effectively. So it's been decades at this point, and all of the institutional memory on how to actually fight a war, those guys are now retiring, or they just have desk jobs in the Pentagon or something. Whereas now Russia has probably the most effective military in the world in terms of actually fighting a peer conflict on the ground. And that's a really bad position for the United States to be in. And it's a position the elites have rather stupidly put us in.
Yeah, I want to talk a lot more about that because I think the effect that this war has had on kind of the Russian standing in the world, the America's standing in the world, and the message it sends to people about kind of the ability to flex on the United States is all incredibly important. But before we get to that, guys, let's hear from Job Stacking. Hey guys, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Job Stacking. More paychecks, less hustle, working from home. That's what Job Stacking is all about. If you're a remote or hybrid worker looking to maximize your earning potential, then consider joining the Job Stacking Mentorship Program. The program is designed by Ralph Haltza, the creator of Job Stacking, to help you successfully implement a strategy that will allow you to collect multiple paychecks from different jobs without burning out or getting caught by employers. Job stacking has already helped many people double or even triple their incomes. Luke Hill, a financial analyst living in the UK, has used job stacking to stack 3 different jobs and went from making $5K a month to $15K a month. But job stacking isn't just about increasing incomes. It's also about helping our guys gain more independence by no longer being a slave to debt or a single employer who hates their values. Andrew Gustafsson, a credit analyst from Australia, is now stacking 4 salaries, which he has used to pay off his personal and student debt and buy a home for his family. If you don't currently have a remote job, no worries. The program is also designed to help you land remote jobs so that you can go ahead and get started. So if you want to double your income and stop relying on a single paycheck from a woke employer, go to jobstacking.com/start now. That's jobstacking.com/start now and book a call with Rolf today. So like you were saying previously, Charlemagne, the fact that Russia has gotten several years now of experience in fighting a modern war, as where the United States is now often, like you said, retiring or sometimes pushing out many of the people who have any experience in a conflict at all, much less a 5th generation war, really sets people's minds to the fact that we are in a precarious situation when it comes to any kind of geopolitical conflict. There's a real irony in the fact that I think the United States, in many ways, originally thought that they were going to be funding the destruction of the Russian Federation, right? They thought that they would be sending Ukrainians in there, destroying them slowly through this war of attrition, draining the Russian military capability, and ultimately winning a victory by neutering what Russia can do. And instead, basically, America has, in many ways, spent hundreds of billions of dollars creating a training scenario in which Russia could level itself up to the point where it may be the most combat effective large-scale force that's currently existing in the world order.
Yeah, that's it's difficult to say exactly what the goals of this war were because the regime is so opaque and schizophrenic. I view this like any war. You have your minimal and you have your maximalist aims. I mean, it does seem to be based on what our politicians and the global leaders in these NGOs state is that basically they want to dismantle the Russian Federation. Now that would be like your maximalist end, right? But they also talk about regime change in Russia pretty openly, which is a step down from actually dismantling Russia itself. Obviously, that hasn't been achieved. I think a lower order goal of that was at least the destruction of the Russian armed forces. Now, obviously, a lot of materiel and people have been lost, but we can see that the Russians have not, after 2 years of conflict, more than 2 years of conflict now, they have not lost their fighting capabilities. At the very least, the United States has achieved sort of a baseline goal of separating Europe and Russia. Europe has been convinced basically to put all of its old Soviet stocks into the war in Ukraine, which they're going to have to replace with the NATO standards. So effectively, Europe has no real way of going back to a different standard. They're now stuck on the Western standards that are led by the United States. And obviously, Europe has been significantly detached from Russia in terms of its trade and its energy relationships. Of course, we had the Nord Stream pipeline. Germany was definitely getting too close to Russia for the United States' liking. So, in terms of like what the Western elites wanted to achieve and what they did achieve, they at the very least detached Europe from Russia and really bumped Europe one step down on the great power potential ladder, because they simply cannot act independently of the United States, because the European peninsula simply does not have access to the resources it needs to develop itself as a great power. It has to trade with the outside world, and the United States has cut that off. So this war has at least achieved that. Going a little back to what we were talking about before, you know, when this war started, the United States shipped over these HIMARS missiles. If you remember, this being talked about, and this really was a game changer. They're game changer. There's these long range missiles, and what they were able to do is hit Russian buildups of munitions far behind the lines, pretty much the entire area of Ukraine, because the range on these things were enough that the HIMARS missiles could hit literally anything in the Russian controlled territory in Ukraine. Now they can still do that, but at this point, 50 to 70% of HIMARS missiles are jammed and fail to hit their targets. So the Russians have learned how to counter our high-tech weapons. We have taught them how to use electronic warfare against us. Now, of course, we can take what we've learned there and try to develop countermeasures to that. But the fact is, we've now given the Russians the ability to jam a lot of our high-tech missiles. I mean, this is a less high-tech example, but you also have the Excalibur, which is this modified 155 millimeter shell that's guided. And when it was first deployed, its hit rate was 70%, and now it's all the way down to 6% from electronic warfare.
Wow.
So the Russians are now countering all these high-tech munitions that we were using against them to allow Ukraine to prevent the Russians from launching any major attacks. But now that's over. Now the Russian electronic warfare is to the point where they can safely build up resources for offensives, because those resources are not simply going to be noticed by American ISR and then hit by a missile that's going to hit with a if you have a 50% hit rate, you fire 2 missiles, right, and then you're going to hit the thing. But that's not the case anymore.
So has this shift really redefined the speed of this war? Because I think obviously we always get the promise from politicians that wars will be quick, and that we'll have this thing wrapped up in 6 months is the classic sell line of every war that ends up becoming a massive slog. But I think a lot of people looked at the technology, they looked at what they thought was a mismatch in certain areas, and they expected that one way or another, whether it was the Ukrainians getting enough technology from the West, or whether it was the Russians overwhelming the Ukrainians with manpower and munitions, that ultimately, whenever the dam broke, this thing would be over quickly one way or the other. And instead, like you said, we've seen several years of constant shelling and people being kind of locked in place in many scenarios. Are we seeing the creation of a new trench warfare due to the capabilities of, or the ability to dismantle many of the capabilities here? What kind of long-term projection? I know there's a lot of guesswork here, so no one's going to bring this footage up and hold you to it. But is there a projection for how long you think it would be to simply secure, like you said, for Russia, the territory that it wants to annex?
Well, the front line has not moved very much over the last year, especially close to 2 years at this point. And Well, this idea of trench warfare tends to be overused because when I hear trench warfare, I think of, World War One, and you have these trench systems that are, literally across the entire country of France. The type of trenches or entrenchments that are built are these are built on strategically defensible positions, and they're not this giant connected network. It's smaller trenches, it's smaller dugouts that you build in order to protect yourself from, like airburst shells and stuff. And yes, there are trenches, but it's not like World War One where you just have this giant line of people in a trench the entire frontage, which is 500 kilometers or something like that. And because then they would all just get killed by artillery, right? So the trenches are spotty. They're disconnected. They're spread out over tens of square kilometers. If you have a brigade, uh, if you have a brigade stationed in some part of the front, their entrenchments are going to be spread over many square kilometers in, especially in this war, it seems like tree lines help, especially because they provide cover from drones. That's the key, right? Is
Mm.
neither side has enough artillery to simply incessantly bomb like every square inch of the frontage, right? So you still have to find where your opponent is and then hit that target with something. It's you still have to make precision strikes in this war. It's not like World War One where you're just sort of indiscriminately bombing one area with thousands of shells for hours or something like that. So we're not in a trench warfare like World War One. You know, in any war, you're going to have entrenchments. So I think that analogy is very much overused. What we are seeing though is just it's infantry on infantry combat, armored combat, artillery shells, artillery duels. One side has an artillery piece. Your artillery tries to locate and destroy that piece of artillery. It's that sort of thing. It's you can think about it like if you've seen, a World War II film, it's probably a lot more analogous to that than what you would see in World War One, what you would imagine in World War One, right? And it's not this it's more high tech because you do have these handheld drones that are providing intelligence for you on an individual level, right? Like there are these drone operator, I forget the name of the unit, but Russia has a unit that effectively is teams of drone operators that go out and scout and try and locate something for the Russian artillery to sight in on and destroy. Right. So this is a new aspect because you wouldn't have that in previous wars that happened, and that's really the key difference is drones. And it's less these videos of drones with a small munition attached to it that flies up and blows you up, right? That happens. The main impact though of drones is being able to see the battlefield. You can literally just see for kilometers, which means nothing can be built up en masse. And this is one of the main problems the Ukrainians had in their counteroffensive last year is how do you put together an offensive that's going to require hundreds of vehicles and thousands of men and concentrate it in an area that's like 10 kilometers wide and not be completely obliterated? Well, they did get obliterated, right? Because it's extremely difficult to do that when both sides can just see everything that the other is doing. So the combat is doesn't happen with massed units. It happens with small platoons moving about, taking one trench at a time. This isn't a sort of big offensive, big arrow warfare where you have like armored columns driving for tens of kilometers. You'll have 4 or 5 vehicles drive into a neighborhood, drop off a few dozen troops, drive out quickly before they get hit by something. You'll have trench raids where a platoon goes into a neighboring trench that might just be 50 meters away, try to take that sort of thing. You're not seeing these massive movements of armies because it's impossible in the current paradigm.
So that almost perfect knowledge, that elimination of fog of war has really reduced the effective unit size because you can't mass anything of any real import in any given time, because if you do, you'll end up losing it pretty quickly because the target is simply too large and it's obvious to the actors. Do you think, obviously we can't read the minds of kind of the current Russian intention, but do you think that it will be enough for Putin to control the regions that he has formally annexed? I mean, obviously the kind of propaganda was always, well, Putin's just going to conquer the entirety of Europe. He's going to sweep the entire map. That was never going to happen. That was always a joke. But there was some indication at different points that he might seek far more Ukrainian territory if it became possible, if it became something available to him. Do you think the weakening, the obvious inability of the United States or other states to go ahead and project power emboldens him to make decisions to capture more territory?
Well, it's impossible to say anything definitive on that, obviously, but I think my read of him is that he remains fairly conservative in his territorial ambitions for Russia, as he always has been. I would be surprised if peace negotiations do take place within the next 6 months or so, that the Russians would seek anything other than the four oblasts they've officially annexed into the Russian Federation. At minimum, they're not going to de-annex those territories, right? According to Russian law, these are parts of Russia now. So at minimum, that's going to be the war aim, which is actually fairly minimal. It's 10 to 20% of Ukraine's geographic territory, something like that. So it's a fairly small part of the country, mostly the Russian-speaking parts of the country. It's certainly possible that the Russians will wish to annex the Kharkov Oblast, and it's certainly possible that they will seek the city of Odessa as well, which would, of course, landlock Ukraine. I think his ambitions and the Russian ambitions will really depend on how quickly the Ukrainian lines continue to collapse. If the rate we're currently seeing accelerates over the next 6 months, especially, the Russians will actually get pretty close to annexing the territories they've claimed in the Donbass, at least Donetsk and Lugansk, right? And if they're able to do that, it's possible that excursions into Kharkov oblasts might result in that being annexed as well. One thing I see happening potentially is a peace negotiation might look like this. The Russians will say, "Okay, well, we've officially annexed these four oblasts: Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk. You have to give us those because we've taken them, right? Even if we don't control all of the territory, this is our minimum. Also, the other oblasts in Ukraine have to have a vote on which country they want to go in, right? And so Russia could annex Odessa without firing a shot simply by including in part of the peace negotiations that this oblast is each oblast is going to vote on whether or not they want to join the Russian Federation, just like before. There's a good chance that these Russian-speaking oblasts like Odessa and Kharkov would actually vote to join the Russian Federation, especially considering the state of Ukraine. I mean,
Right.
even regardless of how you feel about Russia or Ukraine, it's like after what's happened to the country of Ukraine, I mean, which country would you want to be a part of if you're like on the border of Russia and Ukraine and you're given the choice? Seems pretty obvious. So I think a lot of people seem to believe that the Russians are going to have to actually militarily take all the territory that they may end up possessing. But that's not the case, right? This is a war of attrition, not a war of terrain. And the goal is to defeat the Ukrainian army and destroy its ability to fight, basically. And we've seen at this point that the Ukrainian army is no longer capable of launching offensives. They're getting close to the point where they're no longer capable of defending for any significant amount of time in an area that has not been long fortified. The city of Avdiivka, which was taken in March, that city was in Ukrainian hands for 10 years on the front line, right? That is a 10-year stronghold that is built up with concrete. The entire, city is a fortress. Whereas after Avdiivka was taken, the have now advanced past that dozens of kilometers because the Ukrainians don't have the advantage of fortifications they've designed for 10 years to stop an enemy army from taking the territory. I mean, for example, the way the Russians took Avdiivka ultimately, at least one of the major breakthroughs, was they tunneled something like a kilometer through an old sewer line and sent several platoons of men. I think it was around 100 men or something like that behind Ukrainian lines. And this sort of opened up a vector of attack on the surface. right? So that was the kind of stuff that the Russians had to do to break through the fortress city of Avdiivka, despite their many advantages. That's like something you'd see in a movie, right? But that's not the case anymore. Now they're just moving across open terrain because the only fortifications the Ukrainians have are these earthworks, right? They have some older fortifications left, but mostly it's earthworks now. And these earthworks have been built up over, 2 years for the most part at most, and not 10 years. So anyway, to get back to the question, we're seeing now the Ukrainian army losing the ability to actually hold on to any particular given territory that the Russians persistently attack for very long. And eventually what this is going to result in is the entire line is going to start moving at an increasing rate. And that's going to start, as you see that rate increase, that's going to signal the actual collapse of the Ukrainian armed forces. And they're not going to fight all the way back to the Dnieper River, right? It's not going to be the Russians fighting all the way to Kiev for 100 kilometers. Eventually, the Ukrainians are going to have to throw in the towel, because wars don't end with one side 100% wiping out the enemy army, right? That never happens. At some point, the enemy army has to decide, okay, we can't win this war. We're now going to come to terms. And you kind of want to do that when your army is still intact, right? So it would not surprise me if the Ukrainians sought negotiations while their army was still somewhat intact, because that allows you to negotiate better terms. Whereas if you're obviously and entirely defeated and it's just a matter of time, well, why would why would Russia not at that point seek maximalist ends? It would be like if we look at, World War II, for example, and you look at 1944 or 45, it's like, why would the Russians come to terms with the Germans at that point, given that they're obviously going to completely overrun things? Whereas, if you look at something like 1943, where, the Reich was at its greatest expanse, at that point, they're in a much better negotiating position, right? The Germans would have been, even though they had effectively lost the war at this point. And that's kind of the position that Ukraine is in, is they've effectively lost the war, but they can still fight and make the Russians pay a heavy price. And that's a card they have on the table. Although the Ukrainians will inevitably lose the war if current trends continue as they are, and we have every reason to think they will, they still have that card on the table to say, okay, look, you could beat us in another 2 years, but you could save 100,000 lives if you, don't take any more than you have now, something like that, right? So the war is going to come to some sort of negotiated settlement at that point. It's not going to be a total wipeout of the country of Ukraine or something absurd like that. And that's why the front line has not moved, because the war is not about taking all the territory, one step at a time. It's about defeating the enemy army. And part of that is taking terrain, because you have to fight the enemy where they are and make the battlefield more tactically disadvantageous to them, right? So taking Avdiivka is tactically disadvantageous to the Ukrainians, because now they can't fight in highly fortified areas. Now they have to fight in areas where they're going to suffer more attrition, right? That's the point of taking the territory. It's not the territory as such, it's to make it easier to inflict more casualties on the opponent.
I guess the question becomes how much of that decision is really in the hands of the Ukrainians? As we said, so much of their military capacity comes from the West. Depending on who's telling the story, Zelensky is almost entirely an artificial plant created by the CIA. I mean, how much organic power does he really have? How much decision power actually rests in the hands of Ukrainian officials? And how much of this is really all ultimately a decision that's made by NATO or the United States or some other kind of foreign seat of power?
Well, we don't even really have to speculate on this much, because given that Ukraine would lose the war in probably a month or less if supply from the US stopped and other Western countries, the United States can effectively dictate whatever it wants. And I mean, there are times too when the Russian Ministry of Defense calls up our Pentagon and tells the Americans to get the Ukrainians to stop doing this thing, which it's usually like attacking Russian territory. The Russians will literally call our Pentagon, tell them, hey, you need to tell your guys to stop firing into Russian territory, or bad things will happen. And then that happens, right? And then a few months later, the Ukrainians will do it again. I mean, this is the kind of thing that's actually happening here. So the Americans are in charge here, right? Like Zelensky is on paper in charge, but the thing is, the Americans are the ones providing everything he needs to continue the war. If they stop, it's over. So who's in control here? Obviously, Zelensky is not running things. Now, the flip side of that, the ultimate control over the situation lies with the Ukrainian armed forces, or the armed forces of Ukraine, as they're officially called, because we don't know. At least I don't know much about their internal politics within the army itself, but one would imagine that at some point the army is going to have enough of this. The population is going to have enough of this. Like, the writing is on the wall. We're not going to keep fighting and dying in this pointless war. So I think Zelensky's time is numbered, either way. So we could see the Americans decide, okay, this is enough, or we can see the Ukrainian armed forces decide that, okay, this is enough. We're not fighting this war anymore. We need to come to terms, because this isn't like an existential war where Ukraine can't surrender to Russia because Russia is then going to wipe out the entire country or something. Like Ukrainians will understand that okay, we can come to terms and we can survive and maybe be a rump state that joins NATO or something, but we're not going to get wiped out. It's not existential, right? Like some other wars have been, and how the Americans treat wars, right? Russia's a power that can actually be negotiated with by the Ukrainians.
So is the lesson here? I mean, obviously just speculating, but this is the lesson I would learn if I was a foreign power, is really that the NATO or the Western Alliance is simply a force that has to be survived for a short amount of time, because the majority of its power comes from very expensive technology and the ability to basically concentrate media attention. You have once you lose that media attention, once you lose that momentum that comes from that initial burst of propaganda, all of the financial and other essential assets that kind of are attached to that, the more willingness to invest in the war, and the upfront technology that is slowly kind of countermanded by the Russian forces. Really, you end up with just a trickle of in a war of attrition, and then the entire war kind of falls in the favor of something like the Russian Federation. So you have this scenario where, yeah, there's this massive upfront blitz from the West, from NATO, from anyone aligned with the United States, but after 6 months to a year, the American public, the American media lose interest, the funding dries up, the munitions dry up, and the kind of forward-thinking technology, the very expensive technology that's being deployed in the field gets countermanded in some way, and then you end up in a scenario where you can really mop up what's left of the forces that the West has encouraged to overextend themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the United States has no credible means other than the nuclear arsenal with which to threaten Russia. I mean, we can't threaten Russia in a conventional war. This war just demonstrates that. I mean, the logistics of sending American troops to a European front alone are insane, let alone the actual events on the ground that we've seen over the last 2 years. Anyone who looks at this is going to realize that, yeah, this is not possible, right? Even if something crazy like Poland was the jumping off point, right, to attack Moscow. Poland has a massive military at this point. They have a huge air force. But despite all of that, we know that would be utilized to its greatest extent in the first few months or year of the war. And then you would be back to a more conventional type of war with a much more limited amount of high-tech equipment. Now, that's still happening, right? One of the reasons I haven't touched on that Russia is doing well too is they're launching cruise missiles attacks every few weeks or months against Ukraine, usually in these massive bombardments of dozens, I think even up to 100 missiles sometimes, and they hit targets across the entire country, even close to the Polish border. And Russia is manufacturing about 130 to 100 cruise missiles a month, right? Which is basically close to their burn rate. So Russia has the capacity to continue to develop high tech solutions as well, in order to strike deep into Ukraine. So that is a part of it too. It's just relying on that completely is not an option, right? And we've seen that the Western powers, especially the United States, relies far too heavily on its high tech gadgets and sort of gigantism, right? Like with our aircraft carriers. We saw this happen in the First World War, where gigantism took hold in how fleets were built as well. But this war is demonstrating that that sort of thinking is not applicable in a long war. You're not going to win by having, some sort of uber weapon like your V2 rockets or whatever, right? These things can have some effect, but it's not how the war is won. And Russia has shown the West that it can fight a conventional war, and the West has demonstrated that it doesn't have the capacity to supply logistically a conventional war without breaking itself.
So I think a lot of people, like I said, have difficulty finding any reliable information on this. I'm even seeing in chat people saying, "No, Ukraine just launched a massive offensive, and they took all
Yeah,
this land, and they're threatening the Russian homeland at this point." What is the validity of that, and where do you go to find what you feel is reliable information on what's actually happening right now?
Yeah, I figured someone would bring that up. I mean, yeah, the Ukrainians just used their special forces to launch an attack toward Kursk. Kursk is 100 kilometers away from Ukraine. They've attacked 7 kilometers in. This is not even as far as they've gone before. We see these raids every few months. This is not a sustained offensive. It's just a raid. It's going to be overturned in a week or two, as it always is. So, you know, that's the answer to that. In terms of, where to get information from, for most people, if you're not interested in military history and this sort of thing in general, I think one of the best sources is actually from Austria, um, by a colonel named Marcus Reisner. This is a good source. um, Austria is, quote unquote, a neutral country. They're not in NATO, at least, and I find Marcus Reisner from well, this will be hard to pronounce, but it's the Österreichs Bundesheer YouTube channel. Basically, Austria, its military has a YouTube channel, and they do English language videos. This colonel produces these excellent presentations every few months to give you an update. So I would actually, check that YouTube channel, Österreichs Bundesheer, Marcus Reisner. That's Reisner, I think. And check out his videos, and you'll get a decent update every few months. The last one was 2 months ago, titled "The Russian Momentum is Back." He provides really well balanced information, and I think that's really all the average person needs is every few months get some info from a well balanced source. Any Western source, like or American source, like the Institute for the Study of War or something, this is just nonsense. Other source I really like, and this is more for people who want to deep dive, is I really like this YouTube channel titled "The Operational Art of War," um, run by a Canadian guy known as Jimmy Thomas. He's a staff college graduate from Canada, and this is his area of expertise. So to the extent I really know anything about the details of how modern war is fought, it's mostly due to his work, and he's sort of doing a history of the war while it's still going on, using Google Earth, and he is looking at images of the battle around Kiev, and providing his own takes on what he believed happened in that battle. This is really interesting stuff. So that's Operational Art of War on YouTube if you want to really understand the details of how modern wars are thought about from an operational perspective, from an actual staff officer's perspective, and it also gets into the history of war.
Excellent. I know that you're doing a lot more writing than you are YouTube at this point. So before we go to the questions of the people, can you let people know where to find your work?
Yes, I have a blog Charlemagne.substack.com. It's titled Neo Reactor. I just published a really long paid piece on the Suez Canal crisis, which I think is something understudied, a pivotal turning point in the 20th century between America, Europe, and Great Britain. So I recommend checking that out. I've got a free preview of that as well. And of course, a lot of my writing is for the Old Glory Club's Substack. That's oldgloryclub.substack.com. You can also find our website, theoldgloryclub.com. If you go to our events tab, we have a display of 8 or so videos describing the conference we had a few months ago that you had attended, of course. So if you're interested in sort of hearing about that, you can check that out as well.
Excellent. All right, guys, let's head over to the questions of the people. Robert Weinsfeld says, any chance of the Western Oblats eventually leaving Ukraine, Carpathia to Hungary, Chernow to Romania? I'm not sure how to pronounce all of those, but Lviv, Letsk, Rivine, Turnpol, IF to Poland.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that, but I think Carpathia to Hungary, or I'm sure there are some Poles who would love to have Lvov back. But I think this gets into sort of Hearts of Iron 4 map game stuff. I mean, could that happen? Yes. I do not think that's going to happen. I think the country of Ukraine is going to remain mostly intact, sans whatever the Russians end up annexing. But we won't rule it out for sure.
Can you explain for those unfamiliar what the oblast designation is? Is that like a state? Or, what
It's
provinces?
Yeah, more like province. It's not a state. The American state is kind of a unique concept, but yeah, it's basically analogous to a state. Sans the fact that American states have a well, we're supposed to have a high degree of sovereignty in American states, but that's what an oblast is. Yes,
before the 1860s.
Yeah.
Let's see. Life of Brian says, what do you think of the Duran?
They're a great channel to watch daily. I mean, they have interesting takes. They're definitely a bit Russia biased and definitely hype up the capability of Russian victory much more. I mean, the way I look at this war again is, I've studied World War II a lot. I think most people who study that war sort of realize that the war was lost for the Germans in 1941 when they failed to take Moscow, right? But the war continued all the way till 45, and the greatest extent of German conquest was in 43, right? Which is interesting because their territory expanded to the greatest extent halfway through the war, but if you look back on it, you sort of realize that materially it had already been lost, right? So people tend to freak out when you're like, oh, you keep saying the Russians are winning. When are they actually going to win? It's like, well, there's the point at which Ukraine can no longer win the war, but that doesn't mean that the war just stops there, right? It still has to be fought to its conclusion. So the Duran tends to overhype, I think, that conclusion a bit, but they're a fine channel.
And Gabby of Limburg says, maybe our weapon systems aren't that bad. The same people who rolled over to Russia irregulars were at least able to put up a fight 8 years later.
Is this sort of is this sort of referencing the beginning of the war, the same people who rolled over to Russian irregulars?
Yeah, I can't say I'm familiar.
Yeah, I mean, when the war began in 2014, it was the Ukrainian military was very, very small, and irregular forces in Donetsk and Lugansk sort of they held up the Ukrainian military for many months before the front lines solidified where they are. But
I mean, obviously the American weapon systems are superior to what Ukraine would be able to provide itself. No one's arguing that fact. Yeah, it's certainly a upgrade, but this is just the classic problem that America has run into in many different scenarios, and particularly here. It's not that the weapon systems aren't impressive, at least in some way, but that in a protracted battle, the just attrition involved means that these high tech, high maintenance, very expensive systems tend to slowly lose their advantage to more conventional forces.
Oh, I see what he's saying now. He's saying that Russian irregulars were able to take over a large amount of the Donbass in 2014.
Hmm.
Um, and the fact that against the full might of the Russian army now, the Ukrainians are able to hold up the Russians is demonstrating that our weapons are adequate. So yeah, I agree with your response there. I mean, if you're interested too in this subject of what the Ukrainian military has had over the last several years, there's a series of yearly publications that come out. Um, I'll search for it on my computer and then remind you of that at the end of the stream.
Excellent. All right, guys. Well, we're gonna go ahead and wrap things up. Actually,
Oh, okay. Well, I just found
um,
it. It's called The Military Balance. If you are really interested in military capabilities, check out the yearly publication, The Military Balance. It's hundreds of pages, goes through every country.
fantastic. All right, guys. Well, like I said, make sure to check out Charlemagne's work. He does amazing work, as you can probably tell from his appearance here. So check out his channel, check out his Substack, check out the Old Glory Club. And of course, if it's your first time here, make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel. Go ahead and click the bell and the notifications, everything, so that you can make sure you catch these streams when they go live. If you'd like to get the broadcasts as podcasts, make sure that you subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you'd like to pick up my book, The Total State, of course, you can do that on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, or your favorite local bookstore. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I'll talk to you next time.